I really liked All Is True. An interesting thing about it is, if you think about those kind of big production films like Cinderella and Orient Express, which was 70mm, and Thor, and this does definitely have a feeling of somebody going back to their roots. He described it as a kind of, he said like a ruminative chamber piece. And as far as I understand, the production itself happened almost in secret. I was talking to Ben Elton about writing the script, and he said that when he was first doing it, his name wasn't sort of, bandied around, that the script was sent around without his name attached to it, because it's not a comedic project. He wanted people to read it as it was. And I think the first that most of the industry knew about it was that it was pretty much done, was they'd almost finished doing it. And it does have that feeling of something that was made on somebody's own terms. So the other thing is the idea of Kenneth Branagh playing Shakespeare, because Shakespeare has clearly been such a big part of his life, and because he has become the great interpreter of Shakespeare for a sort of modern popular audience. I remember when you and I were at Radio 1 back in the 1990s, and we did Hamlet as the movie of the month, and I remember having a conversation with somebody high up in Radio 1 and saying, we want to do Hamlet as movie of the month. They went, Hamlet? We're a pop movie station. I'm saying, yeah, I know, but believe me, this is the version of Hamlet that everyone is actually... I mean, it was 4 hours long. It was the whole play, pretty much. Yeah, I think it was actually the whole play. But it was, it was a terrific version. And the Shakespeare that he plays here, I'm aware that this is going to spill over the news. So I'm going to be mid-sentence when you stop me, and then I'll literally pick up the other side of the news seamlessly.
Take it to the bridge.
Take me to the bridge. The Shakespeare that he plays is sort of gentle and retiring, but also he's somebody who has lived apparently two lives. On the one hand, he's had this life in which he is this great, renowned playwright, poet, somebody, who is approached at one point by a young student who says, how do you know? How did you know all these things? You haven't travelled to all these places. At one point, there's a conversation about him being mocked, actually, for his lack of knowledge. And the other person saying, how did you know? And he said, well, it all comes from my imagination. So on the one hand, he has that. On the other hand, he has his family life, in which his wife, played by Judi Dench, who is can't read and write, and in which his main function is that he's been absent for most things. The central tragedy at the heart of the story is the loss of the son, Hamnet, and as he says, I wasn't there. He says he was en route back from London at the time. So he's been a presence and an absence. He's been somebody who's lived in a world of literary figures and stardom and all that stuff, and now he's back in a place in which none of that stuff actually has the cachet that it does. In fact, when Southampton comes in and starts reciting the sonnet, one of the reasons that it seems to sort of bristle is because suddenly he's being Shakespeare again, because Southampton actually says, I came to see the poet, and it is from the poet that I take my leave. And that music tells me that it's coming up to news o'clock.
No, you've got at least 30 seconds.
Oh, have I? Okay, fine. So at the centre of it, you have the dichotomy of that character. And yet it's played very gently, very low-key. There aren't sort of, great big striding around costumed moments. He seems to be this gentle, shuffling, slightly bemused figure. A talismanic scene is him in the garden finding out that he's not even a very good gardener. Certainly not as good a gardener as his wife.
Winding himself up.
I was
into a lather of excitement.
So I said, I do think that thing about him sort of bumbling around, uncertain of what his position now is. There's this whole thing about he wants a title, he's bought a title, and Southampton says to him, why? Why do you even care? And although there's been an awful lot of attention on that scene with Branagh and Ian McKellen for obvious reasons, because I think it's well played the way in which they do what you described as almost a rap battle of the sonnet, which is an interesting way of describing it. Because what's really interesting about that scene is how low key it is. I mean, it's candlelit. Actually, the film has a beautiful painterly look to it. You think back to how back in the days of Barry Lyndon, shooting any film by candlelight involved getting NASA involved, and nowadays it is. And I think it is
shot on digital.
Yes, I know, and it's got but it has got a real painterly feel to it. There's one very, very long shot of the lake that Shakespeare goes and sits by, and ponders life and death, and it's really kind of mysterious and magical, which actually, of course, ties in with the later plays, which are not only about daughters, but are also about magic, and also about statues coming back from the dead, coming back to life, and all those things are kind of feeding into it. Obviously, there is a central conceit that Ben Elton has created in order to give the narrative a kind of an arc, which is that he imagines a particular circumstance which is to do with the loss of Hamnet, and that kind of feeds into a whole bunch of revelations and mysteries surrounding, Hamlet's death, which the thing which haunts him is that he wasn't there. I have to say that for all those things that I like, the scenes that I like the best are the really, really low key scenes. There is a scene when Judi Dench is out doing the garden and he walks past and she says, "Husband, will you help me?" And he says, "I actually think you'd be a lot better off without me," because he's not a good gardener. The scene when the student comes and says, "How did you know? How did you know?" And he's just tetchy with him because it's like, I've been asked this a million times over. There's one scene in which he is sort of confronted about, what did you ever do? And, what business were you ever involved in other than writing plays? And there is this one kind of angry response. It's not quite a monologue. It's a response to somebody else in which he says, "This is the business that I ran." But for the most part of it, it's, it has this kind of gentle, ruminative is the word that Branagh used. And I think that is exactly the right word for it. And this is exactly the kind of thing that could fall into lovey-ishness. This is exactly the kind of thing that could be seen as a sort of, as a folly or something which is, a pet project that is more to do with your own. But I know nothing about Shakespeare. I mean, what I know about Shakespeare wouldn't fill the back of a postage stamp. But I did buy into it. There's been a couple of reviews that have said, that have made reference to the fact that Branagh is wearing this huge prosthetic nose. I have to confess, partly because I'm not very observant, I was looking at it for a while before I realised that actually that's one of the main, it wasn't like Nicole Kidman in The Hours. It wasn't the first thing that I thought of. I was just impressed that the makeup was making him look like, I think there are only a couple of illustrations of Shakespeare anywhere, aren't they? So we're not entirely sure what he looked like, but he did look to me like what I imagine that Shakespeare ought to look like. But I thought it was, and it ends in this very lyrical, sad, melancholy one with that song, and I found it very touching.